And on the line with us, our old friend Lori Wallach, the Executive Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, tradewatch.org or citizen.org/trade. And Lori, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Hello.
It's great talking to you again. So a couple of headlines here. The NAFTA 2.0, the deadline is right after Thanksgiving. I think it's November 30th, number one. Number two, Donald Trump has offered farmers a $12 billion bailout, but it looks like less than $1 billion of that's been distributed, and a lot of farmers are really hurting. And this is a consequence of his trade things. And also this inappropriate, insulting protections for LGBTQ workers in this new trade pact. A bunch of Republicans in the House are saying, we won't sign on this legislation if it protects gay workers, which is awful. But anyhow, let me toss those at you. And what's going on with all this stuff?
Well, first item is, yes, the NAFTA 2.0 text that got released on September 30th is heading to be signed on November 30th. That's under the fast-track rules. That's the 90 days of waiting. And the agreement that's going to be signed, though it has some important improvements, still, if enacted as is, wouldn't stop the job outsourcing or raise wages. And there's some new provisions that were added to it that could lock in high medicine prices.
Oh, geez.
So basically, November 30th is when phase 2 of the NAFTA replacement campaign starts, because now with the Democrats as a majority, there is going to be ongoing work to try and improve the deal, which, to be fair, the U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, has been working with the union since the text came out to try and figure out how to improve the enforcement of the labor standards. But there's some other stuff, too. Okay.
So are you, this is actually being done with Congress. Are you actually hopeful that something's good is going to come out of this? Or is it just like, we've gone from insanely terrible to merely terrible?
So the story is that actually they made some big improvements. They took out most of the investor-state dispute settlement system, which is enormous.
Right, the private corporate courts, basically.
Totally removed ISDS between the U.S. and Canada. And, Tom, that's a big deal because all but one of those outrageous corporate attacks and environmental laws have been U.S. corporations attacking Canadian policies. So almost $400 million has been paid out. All those environmental ones have been U.S. firms attacking Canada. So getting rid of that, big honking deal.
Yep.
And with respect to Mexico, there's a big rollback in those rules. There's an exception that's got to get fixed. But mainly there are some important improvements, but though they're improved labor standards, they're not really sufficiently enforceable to make a difference on the ground. And then some really bad stuff relating to medicine patents, expanding big pharma monopolies got added. That stuff's got to come out. Mm-hmm. To answer the bottom line of your question, if we can make the environmental and labor standards subject to swift and certain enforcement, we can get rid of that outrageous pharma stuff and make a couple other important improvements. Actually, the agreement's going to be worth having.
So, and you think that the Democratic Congress might force this?
Sorry, go ahead.
You think a Democratic Congress or House might force this?
Well, I think the reality is the only agreement that's going to get passed is one that the Democrats in the House will approve.
Sure.
So that leverage means we actually have the opportunity to force improvements in the agreement that at a minimum, at least, could pass the do no further harm test, which is to say it could stop some of the serious ongoing damage. I mean, this ain't the transformative, progressive NAFTA replacement, new model of a trade agreement you and I have been talking about for decades.
Yeah, this isn't what Sherrod Brown would write, for example.
Or you would write. But if these improvements are made, this could be actually something worth having, because if it could stop the ongoing serious damage of job outsourcing, pressure downward on wages. I mean, there is language in there, if made enforceable, that would transformationally improve labor rights in Mexico and give our brothers and sisters in Mexico a real chance to have independent unions and fight for higher wages.
And with AMLO coming in, I mean, he's Bernie in Mexico.
Exactly. So, well, I don't know if he's Bernie in Mexico. He's more of a populist than a progressive, but on this issue, he believes in the right thing. So what I'm saying basically is there's a lot more work to be done. And if folks care about this, they should get engaged. There is a great replacenafta.org campaign page that lays out how to work with your members of Congress to demand these additional improvements,
right,
so we get the agreement to a place where it deserves to go into effect. And the test is it going to actually stop the outsourcing, raise wages? And it certainly can't raise medicine prices, or it's a non-starter. So that is the piece of work going forward.
That's great. I believe we've talked about this before. The fact that you and I and basically up until 1992, the entire Democratic Party were all in favor of tariffs, of protectionist trade legislation, which is what built this country. I mean, they were put into place in 1791 or 1793 as a consequence of Alexander Hamilton's 1791 Report on Manufactures, and built this country. And in fact, tariffs paid for the entire cost of the federal government right up to the Civil War, and half the cost of the federal government right up to World War I. And then Donald Trump came along, stole this what used to be the Democratic thing, and campaigned on it, and people love it. But there still are a lot of Democrats who understand this. Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown just won Ohio by 6-8 points when the Democrat running for governor lost the state by a couple of points. So this is potent political stuff. But it seems to me that Donald Trump is setting aside NAFTA. Donald Trump is trying to define our trade policy particularly with China, by executive order using national security as the rubric or as the excuse. And that will only last until he leaves office, unless the next president is completely in agreement with it. And I can't imagine any company saying, let's invest $500 million in building a factory in the United States and stop manufacturing in China based on these tariffs that Trump put into place that are going up to 25%. Correct me if I'm wrong, in December. I don't see any company saying we're going to do that based on just a 2-year window. Trump is not running this stuff through Congress. Do I have that right? And if so, what should we do?
Well, it's a really interesting state of affairs, because it's not just the Democrats who have taken a rather corporatist view of trade, because most of the Democrats actually have taken the people's view of trade. But there's a block of them, and certainly the presidential Democrats have been indistinguishable from the Republican presidents on their trade policies. But the congressional,
with the exception of Bernie.
Well, the presidents.
Yeah.
There have been
presidents. I see. Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about candidates. Yeah.
No, I'm talking about Obama and Clinton, who
right.
as presidents did the exact same stuff that Republicans did on trade.
Right.
But yes, you're spot on with respect to Bernie, and I think some of the people, the senators who are thinking about running for president now, also have a progressive view on trade. The problem is the congressional Democrats have tended to be more critical of the status quo. The congressional Republicans have been lock, stock, and barrel for the status quo. And in fact, one of the few issues on which there's been any willingness to challenge Trump by the Republicans in Congress is on his China tariffs.
Right. So
the reason, Tom, in part, none of this is going through Congress is because it's really hard to get a majority to actually change trade policy in Congress. Now, we have a chance with the NAFTA renegotiation, and maybe with the right kind of China trade policy going forward, the NAFTA fight's kind of the test. With the Democrats in the House, the Republicans might be forced along. But I think that part of the reason the president's done the approach that he has with respect to China is when the Republicans were a majority in both chambers of Congress, there was no prospect of doing anything in Congress on trade.
Right.
And the problem with how the president's done what he did through executive authority is it's been, frankly, kind of backwards, which is it hasn't been strategically rolled out. The targeting hasn't been very smart. So we've had a lot of collateral damage that wasn't necessary, even as the general principle of using the leverage of access to our market and the power of putting up tariffs to stop cheating goods from coming in is the right set of tools.
Right.
The way it's been implemented has been...
Well, and Trump has also politicized it in ways that actually don't even make sense, criticizing Democrats for opposing him when Republicans are actually the ones who are opposing him. I'm curious, Lori, what you think. Was I right that Trump's tariffs, China tariffs, are going to go from either 10 or 15% up to 25% in the next month or so?
You are right as a technical matter. That's what's supposed to happen. But a thing to watch is on the 30th, as well as the NAFTA signing, there will be the G20.
This is the 30th of November.
Exactly.
Okay.
Did I say not? Yeah, November 30th.
Yeah.
There'll be the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires, and that will be at the G20, on the side of the G20. There'll be a meeting between the U.S. and China that's supposed to be the next big discussion of what happens with these tariffs. So, unfortunately, part of the administration, led by Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, is trying to make a very transactional deal of not only won't we bring the tariffs up to 25%, we'll get rid of some of the existing tariffs. If China, you'll just buy a little more of the stuff you're going to buy anyway, like LNG and soy. And then we'll make a deal. We'll back off.
We'll declare victory and go home, in other words.
The people who want to basically give up.
Yeah.
Then there's another part of the administration led by USTR Lighthizer who's saying, not so fast. Unless and until China changes some of these structural behaviors of subsidizing exports, of keeping out U.S. trade, of creating a whole set of privileged China 2025 sectors of the economy to dominate the world and manipulate in any number of different ways how those companies operate in our country and whether or not there is any trade in those sectors coming into China. Until there's some big structural changes on currency misalignments, then no, these tariffs stay in place. And that fight is still playing out in the administration. So if it was USTR and Treasury Secretary Hartmann, yes, the tariffs would go up to 25%.
Right.
Under this fight, it's unclear.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Laura, you always enlighten me. Thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you for having me on.
Lori Wallach, the Executive Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, tradewatch.org, the website. Well, Laura, if you're still on the line, what was that other website about NAFTA?
ReplaceNAFTA.org.
Thank you.
www.replacenafta.org.
ReplaceNAFTA.org. There you go.